that throughout the conference. Next slide. So the national scope of human trafficking, as I said before, California is one of the top destination states. It may surprise many of you that Los Angeles is actually one of the top 3 ports of entry where traffickers bring victims. And so this is why conversations like this are so important, because living here in the greater Los Angeles area, we all have a role to play to support survivors, most importantly, but also address some of the root causes to actually prevent this from happening in the first place. So in California, there are 9 task forces that are operating throughout the state of California. We do have one here in Los Angeles. There's another one in Orange County. And since their inception 2 years ago, they've actually identified more than 1,300 survivors of modern-day slavery. And I think it's important to point out that over 50% of the victims were actually victims or survivors of sex trafficking. And lastly, I want to point out that even though we haven't actually investigated a lot of labor trafficking throughout the state of California, it's because that crime is so under-identified. Many of the experts who work on forced labor issues say because the supply chains that where slave labor is found are so long and complicated, it is sometimes difficult to actually identify a case of modern-day slavery in a corporation or through a supply chain. So we'll talk more about that as well. Next slide. Now, slavery at home. I want to show this visual because this was a case that really put modern-day slavery on the map for this country, even though it had been happening for years and years, where domestic sex trafficking has been happening since time began, but also labor trafficking. The importance of this case, and this was from the El Monte case that happened in El Monte that broke in 1995, where 72 people from Thailand, almost all of them women, were enslaved for 7 years in this makeshift factory. So I point this picture out because it has razor wire all around the compound, but it could not be seen from the sidewalk or from the street. So if you were walking along in this neighborhood in El Monte, you would actually not see the razor wire, and that is why it went unidentified for 7 years. And you know, the conditions in this makeshift factory, in this sweatshop, were horrific. The 72 victims, the only air or fresh air that they would actually breathe every day was when the trucks would come to actually load all of the things that they were sewing inside. And they would put up the garage door about 12 inches so that the victims would be able to put garbage bags of clothes under that door. The rest of the time, they were literally locked in these houses. The windows were boarded up, the doors were locked, and they had no escape. There were dogs and also armed guards who were guarding the victims. And it was really one woman who just couldn't take it anymore, and she found an escape. She was able to escape and went to a local Thai temple. And it took her actually a few months to actually tell anyone what happened because she was so afraid that the traffickers would come after her or her loved ones. But she told someone, and that's when the case started, when the officials and the local NGOs were actually able to figure out that what was happening in this makeshift factory in El Monte was actually modern-day slavery. Next slide. So my organization, CAST, or the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, really got started because of El Monte. And I think the greatest thing about this particular case was that not only was it prosecuted and the victims were able to seek help through local organizations like CAST, but it also woke up policy members, members of Congress. So what happened in the year 2000 was a law and it's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA, that was just reauthorized with new and exciting amendments just a couple of weeks ago. Next slide. Did we lose the slides? Okay. So what CAS does is really twofold. We provide direct services with survivors. Our program is innovative because we work in partnership with the survivors who come to us for help. What that means is we provide life skills training. Many survivors who come to us have never lived in an urban environment like Los Angeles, so teaching them the types of skills to, public transportation, how to cash a check, how to open a bank account. We also do legal services where we're providing criminal representation, particularly in the domestic sex trafficking cases that we do. We do issues of expungement so that survivors actually have a way to get a good job and their record is not going to follow them. We also do immigration remedy for the survivors, foreign national survivors who need status in the country in order to be able to work. And then lastly, we also provide case management and shelter services. We opened the very first shelter in the country for women, trafficked women, and their children. Next slide. So this is the face of modern-day slavery, and you'll be hearing from Flor, who's a member of the Survivor Advisory Caucus and the National Network of Survivors. She's on the professor panel later this morning, so I encourage you all to make sure you are here for the 10 o'clock professor panel. And Flor will be able to tell you her story in greater detail, but I put this up because it is yet another case following the El Monte case where a makeshift factory was created in Los Angeles, and Flor, who's now a survivor, was victimized by the trafficker, made to sew major labels that you would find in major department stores anywhere in the country. Next slide. So human trafficking, as I said earlier, is really a modern-day form of slavery. In fact, I like to use the term modern-day slavery when I'm talking about this issue. It's really twofold. There's what's called forced labor or labor trafficking, and then also sex trafficking or sex slavery. Now, it's important to point out that with child trafficking, you don't need to prove what's called force, fraud, or coercion. Simply put, minors or children cannot consent to sexual exploitation, to sex trafficking. And as a result, the law that we have in this country is really important because automatically children who are in the commercial sex industry are considered or defined as victims of trafficking. And that's important because when we train our law enforcement partners, they're able to help liberate child victims and get them supportive services right away. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about forced labor because this conference is put on by Freedom in Fashion, and in the fashion industry you do have a lot of apparel companies who sometimes unbeknownst to them have slave labor in their very complicated supply chains. So the ILO put out a study just a couple of years ago that found that 43% of all trafficking victims are actually exploited sexually, and another 32% in forced labor. 25% are actually both. So it really shows us that you can't really compartmentalize the two issues. In our cases in Los Angeles, we do see a lot of forced labor cases where sexual assault is used as a tool to control and further exploit the victims in a labor setting. So it's really important to look comprehensively about this issue. Next slide. So you're probably wondering, what is forced labor? What does this look like? And here are some examples of cases that we've actually handled here and all over the world. I want to make a special note of the last bullet, domestic servitude, where 28% of our cases currently in Los Angeles are cases where women are trafficked into LA thinking that they're coming to be a nanny or work at a bakery. Some of them think they're coming to work in a jewelry store. The point is that they think they're coming to work legitimate jobs, to be able to send money home to their families, to support their children and their families. And once they get here, their passports are confiscated, and they're told that they have to work every single day, many times 18 to 20 hours a day. Many of them are forced to sleep in the hallway or certainly not in a bedroom. In many cases, they're taking care of the traffickers' children and their pets. And they go through a lot of degradation. So the traffickers are treating them really almost like animals. And you'd be surprised to know that many traffickers actually tell the victims, dogs have more rights in this country than you do because of the lack of immigration status. They hold that over the victims' heads. So domestic servitude is a huge issue in Los Angeles. And when you think about all of the affluent areas that we have in Los Angeles, that's where these cases are. We've had them in Beverly Hills, we've had them in Long Beach, we've had them in pretty much every neighborhood in the city. Next slide. So you're probably wondering, who are the traffickers? And this is where sometimes the media is not always helpful to us, through those of us working in the movement. The media tends to portray traffickers as these big, large, organized crime entities. Those are some cases that we've handled, but the majority of them are actually not related to large, organized crime. They are sometimes families, including diplomats, who are recruiting in their home country, usually in impoverished areas. They are agricultural operations, so business owners, and sometimes they're even neighbors or family members. And when you hear the professor panel today, you'll hear more about the profile of traffickers. Next slide. So people are recruited in a number of ways. They're recruited through family or acquaintances, as I said before, newspaper ads, or through word of mouth. And we're actually seeing an increase in social media being used, particularly in the sex trafficking cases that we handle at CAST, where social media is being used to not only recruit victims, but also as a way to advertise commercial sex services, and that's where they are advertising to the Johns. So I think technology in the future will play an even larger role in this particular issue. Next slide. So getting back to global supply chains, again, because this is a Freedom and Fashion conference, I was asked today to talk more about supply chains. And so, you know, I think everyone should understand that there's actually a greater focus on looking at the complications of supply chains and how they keep getting longer and longer. And this is really one of the root causes of forced labor, where because supply chains are getting that much longer, what we're finding is that the workers who are exploited in forced labor situations are at the very bottom, usually, of those supply chains. And when you take a company, a large company, like Disney or Gap, or some companies I know who've really taken a proactive approach recently to put in some better practices so that slave labor isn't happening in their supply chains. They will even tell you that it's virtually impossible to know what their subcontractors are actually doing. So they'll have an agreement with one of their subcontractors in a factory in another country, but they actually aren't there on site. So they're doing third-party auditing, they're doing worker interviews to find out if slave labor is happening, but the reality is that they really don't know. And this, I think, is something that we as consumers really need to get behind, because we can certainly do something with our power of consumerism to be able to help companies make the right decisions and go above and beyond the compliance policies that they have to adhere to. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Next slide. So another good resource is the Department of Labor. They put out a report on goods and services, or goods mostly, that were produced by child or forced labor a couple of years ago. And I put this up because what we found is that there's 122 goods in 58 different countries, which I thought is interesting because CAST actually has served victims with shelter and case management, victims from 58 countries around the world. So it's the same exact number. But what they found at the Department of Labor is that these goods are actually produced with a significant amount of forced labor and child labor. And this is just a brief list of where slave labor and child labor is pretty prevalent. Next slide. So I want to bring it home now, since we're all from the area. I want to bring it home to California. So what we did a couple of years ago, and you all saw Julia Ormond in the video, who was a partner of CAST when we sponsored the very first comprehensive law in the United States on supply chains. So it's called the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act of 2010. It actually did not, it was not enacted until January 1st of this year. So what we have now in place is a law that requires companies who make at least $100 million in their annual gross receipts to be transparent or post on their homepage what they're doing to address slave labor in their supply chains. So you can imagine we got a lot of calls right before January 1st from these companies' attorneys who wanted to know how to comply with this law. And what has happened out of this, even though there was a lot of resistance from the business community initially, what has happened through the last several months is that they're now much more open to partnering with organizations like CAST to, assess if their policies and their employee trainings and the policies that they have their subcontractors adhere to, if it's sufficient. So it's opened up this whole new dialogue between the non-governmental organizations who are trying to prevent modern-day slavery with businesses, big corporations, where slave labor really is in their supply chains. So our approach at CAST is not shaking a finger at the businesses or trying to ruin their reputation, but rather to really invite them to talk about this important issue, and we really see them as partners in addressing modern-day slavery. And I have to say, I've been very impressed with the companies who are so open to working with us. Next slide. Another study that was done that I want to mention today is one of our partners, Verite, did this amazing study called Help Wanted. And there were a lot of findings there where it examined how foreign labor brokers are playing an increasingly larger role in the issue of modern-day slavery. So for example, I remember 8 years ago at CAST, it was common for us to see victims being charged a fee by a labor broker that was about $1,000 on average. Recently, we're seeing fees of $30,000 to $40,000 being charged. So labor brokers are actually noticing that because this industry is so unregulated, that they can really make a large profit. And so what we're doing with our coalition partners is putting forth some legislation in California this year. It will be carried by Senator Steinberg out of Sacramento. And we are going to take a big look at how this industry can be better regulated to end this type of abuse. Because as you know, or as you can see, this creates a situation of debt bondage where recently we had a case involving male agricultural workers, and their fee was $40,000 to get here, and they paid it. They paid it by borrowing money from loan sharks in their communities in Thailand. And what do you think is going to happen to their families, right, when they're not paying that loan back to the loan sharks in their community? Their children and their families are at risk in their hometown. So these debts are very real for the survivors that we serve, and this is how we're addressing it systemically to make sure that these brokers are regulated. Next slide. So Well, actually, I just kind of said this, but okay. So how they work is they charge these fees. They do misrepresent the terms in their contract, and believe it or not, there oftentimes are contracts with the victims. It's just that the brokers don't adhere to those contract terms. They do use a lot of falsified work permits or visas, and you know, as I said before, they really take away the freedom for those workers to move once they're here. Next slide. So now that we know what is it that I'm asking you to do today, and this is the part where we're really going to take action. Next slide. So I put together just some effective approaches that we found at CAST in our 15 years of working on this issue. What has really worked? The first thing is having broad-based, either if it's a local coalition or a global coalition, it doesn't matter, but the most important thing we found is that it be broad-based. An example of this is we belong to a national policy coalition called ATTEST, and we have brought together different groups and different organizations that wouldn't normally work together. So we've got very different political viewpoints, we've got a different approach to work on this issue, but coming together, we create a shared agenda. So we can all agree on something like the foreign labor broker issue, and that's what we're going to sponsor legislation on. So having a broad-based coalition approach and really thinking outside the box, you know, maybe it's a very progressive community-based organization, a church group, and a politician, and a PTA from a school working together on something on modern-day slavery. This is the approach that we found that really works. And we're going to talk about this, I think, during the next keynote. And then, oh, well, that's okay. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was survivor leadership or worker leadership. One of the unique things about CAST is that we really see victims as our partners in ending modern-day slavery. So we don't have a traditional approach to providing direct services with people. What we do when someone comes to us for help is we develop an individualized service plan, and it's less about getting them into a shelter or providing, you know, traditional case management. It's more about learning what their life goals are and helping them to achieve their life goals. For some, it's getting their GED. For some others, it's going to college or running for office or reuniting with their family back home. Everyone has different goals. And for others, it's getting their records expunged so that they can apply for those better jobs. So this is important in the way we do our work, because once people graduate from the case management program, they are then able to go into a leadership development program. And what that means is they learn policy skills and media advocacy skills that you'll learn about during the professor's panel today. But they are really creating systemic change. In fact, just a couple months ago, many survivors who are part of the National Survivor Network came together and had a White House meeting with high-level executives at the White House. And they were able to educate them on domestic trafficking, sex trafficking, this issue of foreign labor recruiters, all of this amazing stuff. And what happened was that President Obama at the Clinton Global Initiative back in September decided to actually dedicate his whole speech on modern-day slavery. And at that time, he actually called for an executive order where now our federal government is looking at all of the contracts they have with subcontractors, and that includes the Department of Defense, so that they are trying to curb the issue of slave labor in those supply chains. So just imagine how big that is. I mean, our federal government has huge contracts with lots of different businesses that do different things for them, from police uniforms to landscaping materials. There's tons of contracts that happen with our tax-paying dollars. And our government is now taking responsibility, as they should, to make sure that they are decreasing as much as possible slave labor in those contracts that they're buying. So this is a picture of two survivors from the National Survivor Network with President Obama and President Clinton right before President Obama announced this major executive order. It was a big day for everyone. Next slide. So, if you remember anything from today, because I know it's an early Saturday morning, I want you to remember that if we invest in survivors today, and that's through case management, life skills training, even as simple as believing them that this happened to them, that's important. If we invest in that now, we actually are investing in social change. Next slide. And so what that means is when we're investing in survivors, those are the people with the authentic stories and the authentic expertise that you'll learn about today who will create this systemic change to end modern-day slavery in our lifetime. So the whole goal of what we do at CAST and what I hope you'll learn from this conference is that if we invest in survivors and workers today and really help them to rebuild their lives, because they will, they can then reinvest that into the type of social change with us as partners. So with that, I'll end my preliminary conversation with you, and I hope you've learned a lot about the parameters of modern-day slavery and how it actually happens right here in our backyard. I'd like to ask you to please go to our website after this conference and join us either on Facebook or Twitter. You can get legislative updates that way and really get actively involved to do something. You can volunteer at organizations. You can hold fundraisers for organizations that provide services to victims. But most importantly, you can really act as a consumer. I mean, you can actually, through one of these websites, the Chain Store Reaction, you can actually send an email directly to a company asking them to have policies in place that address slave labor and supply chains. So there's a lot of things that we can do simply as members of the community. So I want to thank you very much.